are the 3, 5, or 10 most important things or actions that we need to take for Africa? And what is it that we need to avoid, or what, if we're doing something wrong, what it is that we should stop doing, according to him? I believe that since he is dedicating his life to good governance, he should consider good governance to be fundamental for aid to bring results and in order to disseminate wealth to all citizens. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Nico Schroever from the Netherlands.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd just like to point out that on the basis of the Lisbon Treaty, member state policy and EU policy should be added to and strengthen each other. We would like the EU itself to practice what it preaches. In other words, good governance is something which the European Union needs to engage in itself. I was happy to hear what Dr. Mo Ibrahim said about the need for consistency in our policy. And I would like to ask the panel what their thinking is, what ideas they might have in getting greater consistency in EU policy in the very broad area of development cooperation, human rights, international environment policy, agriculture, fisheries, and international trade. Secondly, the panel also referred to the Millennium Development Goals. Now, 2015 is around the corner. In this post-2015 agenda, are there now proposals to convert the MDGs into sustainable development goals? And my question to the panel is the following. What will the EU input be in converting the, promoting sustainable development goals, and what lessons can we learn from the Millennium Development Goals thus far? And my final question, specifically to Barry Andrews, he quite rightly referred to the concept of responsibility to protect when it comes to Syria. Now, of course, we're all in despair about this. What initiatives can Europe take to at least get to grips with the situation in Syria? Could he be somewhat more specific? Does he have any specific ideas himself? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Margaret Young from the United Kingdom House of Lords.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I think the nature of the debate about development has changed significantly over the last 10 years or so, and I think that's been particularly in relation to African countries. Clearly, governance is important, as Dr. Ibrahim has pointed out, and the idea that aid should work to end aid is, of course, the right route to be taken. But given that the EU has committed to substantial development funding, where and importantly how is this to be administered to be more effective, and is there a way of working more coherently perhaps with the European External Action Service to ensure that it's much more effective? We recently carried out an investigation into the workings of that organisation. Next point is about leveraging trade and investment, which of course is important, but there are really legitimate concerns about some of the ethics and the ways in which companies that may be based in Europe operate when they go abroad, not applying the same kinds of standards as they would at home to the countries into which they're going. And obviously, again, governance is an element in that particular transaction. But how can issues such as the non-payment of tax, which Ms. Striffler has pointed out, and land grabbing and employment and environmental abuses, how can these be discouraged from the EU end of affairs? And then finally, is it possible for the EU to tap into the energies and commitments of diaspora communities who worldwide contribute an enormous amount in terms of remittances to their home countries? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Honorio Novo from Portugal.
Senhor Presidente, caros colegas, sabemos bem que a União Europeia e os seus Estados-membros Chairman, we know that member states in the European Union are the main donor of development aid. Without calling into question that aid, it's always been vital, but development obviously to continue has to address major issues, because often what happens is that aid doesn't really reach its destination, and it trickles out through intermediaries and at official and unofficial level. And unfortunately, we're continuing to supply aid in these cases. And there's another question. How much are we making sure that we're not just providing fish, but providing technology to teach people to fish, to teach people to produce things themselves? So there's a risk that we provide aid with strings attached, so that basically people are buying our goods or using our goods rather than improving their capacities. And then the EU countries are still, on average, below the 0.7% to development aid. But the problem is people just don't have the money, they don't have the budget, but public funds are increasingly spent on bailing out banks and financial institutions and the shareholders of those institutions. I mean, what we're saying is we don't have enough money, but we ought to be putting that money into investment and growth and fighting unemployment, and also development aid policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next contributor is Jana Jenko from Slovenia.
Thank you for giving me the floor. Dear Chair, dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to welcome the discussion on development, which is significant because in 2015, MDG as well as development financing objectives should be fulfilled. This is why I also need to mention the Commission's communication from February this year, Dignified Life for All, with a very significant subtitle, Eradicating Poverty and Securing Sustainable Future. I definitely agree with the fact that eradicating poverty and sustainable future and well-being are the greatest challenges we are facing in the future. I'm also convinced that these two challenges should be confronted within a general framework which is universal to all countries. I know that unanimity is difficult to achieve internationally. This is why I do hope that the EU will formulate a uniform approach, focusing on post-2015 development cooperation, as well as Rio+20. It should also focus on approach that should be taken based on human rights and global partnership for development. By way of conclusion, I would like to point out that when formulating a future development agenda, the principle of ownership of developing countries should be considered, as well as a principle of responsibility for their own development. These countries should mobilize their own resources to prop up their own self-development.
Thank you very much. Back to our panel. Who'd like to answer first? Shall we go ladies first? Michelle? Would you like to?
Beaucoup de choses ont été dites.
Well, many things have been said, and I won't try and respond to the questions. There weren't really so much questions, but I think that, yes, indeed, there has been, or there is corruption in developing countries. I wouldn't say that. We have corruption as well here. But I think that the way in which we work has changed. And I mentioned earlier that we've put in place a system which differentiates, i.e. that we want to give to the poorest countries, but not to give the impression that we're giving millions of euros to governments, and we don't know where that money's going, where it ends up. We have to clear up the fact that that image is no longer true. And obviously, although obviously we'll never be able to eliminate corruption 100%. I would like to come back to a number of points that have been touched on. Europe has made good use of the resources in developing countries. And I think sometimes Europe has worked in a way which is not as dignified as it perhaps might have been. So I think that we do need to be a little bit more humble and put things in context. What I would say today is that in Europe, we are, and we talked about this the other day in a major conference in Paris, but we're in the process of doing something, make things that aren't needed. So we need to stop saying, yes, there's a lot of wealth, people just have to manage for themselves. And I think we have to focus more and ask the right questions. Now, obviously, if you look at farming, for example, yes, it's a tough job. They don't earn very much. But there's a huge difference in circumstances between a European and an African farmer. So I think we need to work together and put in place policies which are consistent and coherent. Whereas at the moment, on the one hand, you have the European Union doing what it does and the member states doing what they do. And there's not a huge amount of coordination. So I think we need to work on that. And as to the developing countries, obviously we have to work on governance. I know there are some countries where that's very difficult. And I wouldn't agree with my colleague Louis Michel on this point, but I think there has to be some conditionality. And you have to try and ensure that there is a certain degree of resilience as well. Now, and we've heard about the fish and teaching people to fish. I think that's an important perspective as well. We need to work with the population concerned. And I think also it'll be time that we invest in developing countries, because in a way they're put to one side. If you look at China, if you look at India, they are doing business with Africa. We need Africa today. There are thousands and millions of young people in Africa. There's a huge need for development in Africa. I think they're lagging behind in development, but the world needs Africa. So we have to help governments to have better governments and to focus more on certain values, and also that conditionality to ensure that certain conditions are adhered to. So maybe the stick and the carrot, but the overall picture is that we need each other. And I think the time that we just handed out money willy-nilly is in the past, as it should be. Thank you.
Barry?
Thanks, Chairman. Just to say that, just to answer some specific questions, I think on the coherence issue that an example of where the European Union could be more coherent in terms of policy is that whereas on the one hand we, certainly in Ireland, prepared to give out visas to people with high qualifications from developing countries, the other hand, we are trying to make sure that they stay in the countries in which they originate, in order to add to the add value in their own country. So sometimes our policies don't really fit into each other. And agriculture is one example. Our economic partnership agreements that have been signed between the European Union and certain areas provide a challenge to that agenda and are worth exploring in a bit more detail. The Dutch delegate is asked about the MDGs and the SDGs, and it's true they are separate initiatives. But so the MDGs, the post-2015 agenda, the SDGs, the UN Draft Climate Change Convention, all of these things might be separate agendas and separate initiatives, but they have to be driven together because we can't afford to be wasting time dealing with them as separate initiatives. It's absolutely imperative that they run together. In relation to R2P, any specific ideas? I pointed out that under the Geneva Convention, it is the case under customary humanitarian law by reference to the the international community and the Red Cross, that there is sufficient legal justification for cross-border humanitarian relief now. That is my suggestion, and it's protected under an interpretation of the Geneva Convention. I can't put it any stronger than that. In relation to Margaret Young from the House of Lords, there is a UN Global Compact, which is a 10-point plan, which requires major private sector organizations to sign up to it. And it carries with it all sorts of ethical requirements, such as child labor, such as land degradation, water resources, where private sector will commit to these ethical responsibilities. But it is very weak. And I think it is one of the areas of incredibly interesting development, is how we begin to develop codes of ethical investment. And we should be driving that on a political level, no question of doubt about that. Whether it comes from, a very good example is where President Obama brought 400 blue chip companies onto the lawn of the White House, and he got each of them to sign up to a commitment to zero deforestation. And it was a long day to get there, but it is a good example of how a political initiative can result in a much better ethical framework for investment in developing countries. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Barry. Mo, did you want to get in?
I think few important questions raised. Where shall we focus help? I think the most important area is to building capacity. Yes, people talking about learning how to fish as more effective. Building capacity is really important in Africa. I outlined what is the main agenda, which is youth, agriculture, and infrastructure. Infrastructure, of course, is an area where for many years international community really did not like to get involved in, while it is really important base for development. Until the Chinese came and started to really focus on infrastructure, then we realized here that maybe we should also get involved. That's really important, the infrastructure area. But capacity building is important in the area of education, etc. When we say integration of economic integration of Africa, it needs infrastructure to unbend this. It needs the roads, the railways, the ports, etc., to connect Africa together in order to move really trade and production. So that's important. But something else also you need to, you can offer, which is not money, is know-how. European project has been a great project, and we in Africa admire very much what you achieved, although many European people maybe don't appreciate nowadays what you have achieved, given some discontent in some quarters. But we think the ability really to create this free trade area across Europe, I mean, of course, started with peace in Europe, which is very important. Europe has been a killing machine for 1,000 years. To stop that was a great achievement. But also the integration issue is very important. You had some know-how to teach our people in the African Union, etc., how to achieve the trading area, how to harmonize customs and this sort of thing. It's not money, it's just know-how. That can be very important. And the issue of corruption and accountability, etc. Of course, something we need really to focus on that issue. But I would argue that each corrupt politician usually will have on the other side 10 or 20 corrupt business people, because that's the nature of corruption. You know, political leaders don't corrupt themselves. Now, let us be frank and talk as friends, and we cannot be real friends if we cannot be frank with each other. Until almost 12 years ago, corruption was legal in Europe. Actually, it was tax deductible. Okay? So you have tax incentives even to be corrupt. 12 years ago, under pressure from OECD, corruption became illegal in Europe. Can we ask how many cases have been prosecuted in every European country till now? As a friend, I can ask you, are you people serious in fighting corruption? Why are you implementing your own laws? Have you seen the report of OECD this year, which criticizing European countries for lack of action on corruption? Do you have the moral right then to start lecturing people about corruption if you are partners in corruption? I think we really need to be frank and talk seriously about this issue. So we need to get together to fight corruption. And I tell you, the civil society in Africa, we are really working hard to stop that. And transparency, because of social media, because everybody walking the street now have a radio station, a TV station in his pocket. And all this is really helping to improve transparency. So we ask also for action on your side to match what we're trying to do there, and that's an area of corruption. But let me move from corruption to a much bigger area actually, which is the illicit transfer of funds. Africa loses every year somewhere between $70 billion and $130 billion, depending on the source of the information, every year in illicit transfer of funds. That is double the total amount of aid coming from everybody, including Europe, into Africa. Is it time to stop that illicit transfer of funds? Corruption estimated at 4 or 5% of that. So maybe there are more important issues than petty corruption. How many multinational companies pay taxes in Africa? Important question. And everybody turning a blind eye to this until it came and bite you back in the butt in Europe, and people realize here that there is some big issues about non-payment of tax. And I think it's time for people really to take action. It's unacceptable anymore for people to use transfer prices in order not to pay their taxes where their profit did arise really, where their sales took place. That is really an important issue. That issue will provide to Africa much more than the total amount of aid you are giving to Africa. And I noticed from your table here, which is a very wonderful document, I was just reading it before I come here, that with the exception maybe of Sweden, Denmark, and United Kingdom, none of the European countries are going to meet their commitments. European Union will not be able to meet its commitment in aid. I suggest maybe you act on the area of illicit tax transfer and you end up doing much more in reality than fulfilling your 0.7%. That action is painless. You don't have to put your hand in your pocket. But it needs a moral backbone from our politicians and our governments and our parliaments in order really to clean up all this mess taking around in that area. And I stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Our next contributor is Miguel Martinez from the European Parliament.
Thank you, Chairman. I think after what Mo Ibrahim has just said, certainly
it's quite difficult to add anything because I think you have been putting the things exactly as one should put them. En cualquier caso, yo
At any rate, I would like to add to some of the information that's been provided, because we need to take account of, quite apart from what's been said about the European Union dedicating funds to development. You also have to look at the European Development Fund. We're talking about 22.6 billion euros from 2008 to 2013. This isn't put on the community budget. It's money which the member states of the European Union contribute on a voluntary and direct basis. And this is money which is covering the expenditure of the Cotonou Agreement. That's the most important agreement between the developed and developing countries in the world. 78 countries, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Caribbean, former UK and Dutch or French colonies, countries in the Pacific, but 78 countries benefiting from the agreement. And there's a special characteristic to this, which I think is of interest to ourselves, because the programs, the way they're funded and the way they're implemented, is on the basis of direct parliamentary monitoring involving the European Parliament and national parliaments in all the countries involved. This is an ACP EU Parliamentary Assembly. So Mr. Michel, the former commissioner and minister from Belgium, and the vice president of the Kenyan the vice president of Kenya also is the co-chair. And it's very interesting because it also makes it possible to act and to raise some of the issues that our panelists have referred to. And it's also interesting that this assembly organizes electoral monitoring missions precisely to ensure transparency and proper electoral procedures in the various countries. And also a couple of marginal points. I think we've had a very tough discussion on ownership of the programs. It should be the countries that benefit from the programs who decide on the priorities. And I think that amongst friends, we have to accept that there are some problems, because the priorities of some of the African countries sometimes are fully in line with ours. We feel that it's right that they take ownership. But we have to be careful that we really mean that in all areas. Now, there's a question of China too. The European Parliament constantly criticizes the behavior of China, and I'd be far more reticent about criticizing China. They have never sent their armies to occupy countries in Africa, which is something that we've done for centuries.
Jean Bizet from France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chairman. The EU's development policy is very closely linked to this humanist approach. Implicitly, the spirit, in the past it was the spirit of the founding fathers, and now we see increasing populism. Now, above and beyond the image of the Union that this policy contributes to, this policy is also an essential part of stability, progress and balance throughout the whole region. And I'd like to point out that through a more simple and efficient management of migratory flows, we can contribute to this. This policy should be based on the concept of sustainable development, and therefore needs to be aligned with our energy policies, with our trade agreements, with our agricultural policy. This policy must look at past developing countries which are now to the forefront: China, India, Brazil. These countries are now the major global powers, and they need to be aware of the impact that their policies have on the global balance. So the aid of the European Union can only fully play its role if we take on board this new reality. But I'd like to have your opinion on these two essential points. On one hand, managing migratory flow, and secondly, the impact of the policies of China, India, and Brazil.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Yildirim Ramazanoglu from Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am a member of the Turkish Parliament, and I have two extremely important remarks and one important question about Turkey and EU relations. First remark: the standard principles of EU should be commented and applied to all countries in the same justified way, absolutely. Otherwise, my country, Turkey, and our Turkish citizens may feel themselves discriminated negatively because of these unreasonable double standard applications. Unfortunately, this negative discrimination against Turkey is a reality now. Second remark: considering the evaluations of recent events in Turkey, please do not regard only social media communications, but please consider and respect also the real, true information supplied by independent sources, as well as your own official ambassadors in Turkey, for reaching the complete and correct information about the matter. You will then obviously see that Turkish security forces have never been involved in peaceful activities, peaceful protests in Turkey.
Yildirim,
yes.
Can I ask you to address the topic of the debate for the speakers that we've assembled, please?
Okay, right.
Thank you.
I mean, you should check it out through your ambassadors in Turkey for getting the real information and trust. Maybe only just for one point about Syria, because some speakers have mentioned about it. Turkey is a very close neighbor to Syria. And at the moment, more than 300,000 refugees are in our country, and for their comfortable housing, we spent more than 1 billion euros until now. And on the other side, chemical weapons are used in Syria. In spite of these very important realities, we don't still know what is the exact position of EU in front of these problems. Thank you.
Next speaker is Elena Fattori from Italy.
Dear colleagues, we're at a turning point here in looking at our development policies. The next deadline, which is 2015, means that we have to develop new strategy, new objectives, so as to prepare a framework for post-2015. Now, as we've recently seen in the report of the UN high-level panel, we need a new development agenda for post-2015 on the basis of Millennium Development Goals. Now, as the UN panel stated, the whole idea is to leave no one behind. And the Millennium Development Goals, the purpose of them was to reduce poverty in all its forms across the board. Currently, 1.3 billion people are suffering, and basic human needs are remaining unsatisfied. We could be the first generation in the history to put an end to hunger in the world. This is a challenge which we as European citizens must not tackle and win by 2030. So we need to look at issues of governance, human rights, peace, human dignity. These are all an integral part of the post-2015 agenda. We need to facilitate sustainable development, put it to the heart of the matter through climate change, protecting natural resources, and promoting new models of production and consumption. Now, as we heard in the recent conclusions of the Environment Council of the EU, for the 2015 strategy, we need to have this integrated into Rio Plus 20, which is reviewing sustainable development goals. Sustainability and economic, environmental and social sustainability need to be at the heart of all this. So the institutions and the policies of the European Union need to interact with the UN, but in a way which will not allow governments to have a complete monopoly, but will involve parliaments and civil society in developing decisions. I think that Europe needs to play a guiding role through developing binding and ambitious goals, through its diplomatic skills in getting new global players fully implicated. Now, it's clear that the role of the emerging economies is a new geopolitical game changer, and we therefore need to develop a new development strategy. The resistance of the PIGS countries, for example, of accepting global standards needs to be dealt with through principles based on fairness, and we need to have shared but differentiated approaches. Thank you.
The next speaker is Mr. Panimondas Marias from Greece.
Chairman, we listened with great interest to the speakers who spoke about poverty in Africa. Let me say that based on data published recently, it seems that 39% of global wealth is at the hands of just 1% of the world's population. This means in practice that the world economy operates in such a way that the distribution of wealth is not equitable, because the world economy does produce a lot of wealth. It's the distribution that is not fair. Another issue that should be of concern is Africa's and Europe's place in the distribution of labor on the global scale, because this, once again, is the reason for the extreme poverty in Africa. Let's not overlook the fact that for many, many years, for decades, Africa was, in essence, a colony of Europe. Well, gradually, the European South, too, is becoming a kind of colony of the prosperous European North. So there is a moral issue here, a moral issue for Europe that needs to allocate sufficient funding for development aid in Africa. Unfortunately, it seems that huge amounts are spent for the bailout of owners of major banks, banks that led us to this global financial crisis. Another very important topic is to do with illegal migration and the influx of immigrants from Africa to the European Union. At this point in time, Greece is suffering from an excessively high number of illegal immigrants. It seems to be very easy for them to cross the border from Turkey, and they tend to remain in our country because, according to the rules of Dublin II and other EU provisions, these economic migrants cannot reach countries of Central and Northern Europe where they would really like to go. So this very important issue of illegal migration is very closely linked to development aid that should be given to African countries. We believe that investment is required. Growth opportunities should be given to those countries so that young people in Africa can remain in their own countries, so that they can work and prosper in Africa. Unless we follow this model, and unless Europe invests considerable funds in growth in Africa itself, not only is there a moral issue, given that Europe and other developed countries have, in essence, condemned Africa to underdevelopment, but we will not be able to find solutions for the huge migratory flows that put Europe and Greece under pressure, and there's no more room for illegal migrants in my country, at least. Thank you.
Barry, would you like to respond first?
Thank you, Chairman. I'd just like to say that in 2050, the population of the world is likely to be 9 billion, and most, if not all of that growth will come in the developing world. and while the European Union population is likely to stagnate, and in the 6 major cities where that growth is going to happen, their population will increase by more than the existing population of Europe. So the pressures from urbanization in the developing world are just so much greater than anything we can really imagine in Europe. And it requires a 60% increase in consumption if we are assuming we stand still in terms of our practices and our wastefulness. So while I understand that there are clear pressures in certain countries in relation to migratory flows, the real picture, standing at a higher remove for the global picture, is much greater than that, and it's something a lot more profound over the next 25 years than anybody can really imagine. I would say that in relation to the comments from the Turkish delegate, that I can't comment about the internal situation naturally, but I can say that the Turkish government have been exceptionally welcoming of refugees and have provided incredible facilities for refugees coming from Syria. And I think it would be remiss of me not to remark upon that. And GOAL operates out of Turkey into Syria, so we have a very clear knowledge of that, but I clearly can't make any comment about the internal position. Finally, on the emerging countries, the BRICS that are being referred to by a number of contributors, India is a good example, and I gave the example of how GOAL is completely reconfiguring our approach as an NGO in India, and that's where GOAL began in 1977 as an NGO. And so we have got to a point where aid has justified itself by no longer being needed. And so we simply operate an arm's length program there, where we simply identify, provide a financial indemnity for GOAL's operation in India. In relation to China, I think we could spend at least 2 or 3 days talking about the influence of China separately from today's discussion, but it clearly is having a very large bearing on the way in which Africa is developing. And as parliamentarians, particularly European parliamentarians, you have to make a case for democracy. The other countries that are exercising a gravitational pull on the development of Africa, we shouldn't hide behind the very basic tenets and first principles of democratic procedure that we all sign up to, believe in, and feel has been the real engine of growth in this part of the world. So there would be my comments at the moment.
Thank you, Barry. Mo, maybe first?
Yeah, let me just comment on a couple of points. One thing about the post-2015, I think the Millennium Development Goals were very important. It focused people's mind in trying to achieve. Whenever there is a milestone, then people strive to really concentrate. It concentrates the mind. And that has been excellent. The one issue I think we need to think about is, are we able to measure this objective? I don't think so. There is a big problem, which is the lack or sometimes a non-existent of the statistical offices in many developing countries. And this is a major capacity issue. You cannot drive your car without measurements on the board. You cannot fly a plane without measurements. How can you run a country without any data? This is a major problem. And when we say we succeeded in taking half the people out of poverty, if you look carefully at the graphs and the numbers, you will discover something very, we met the poverty target only thanks to China. It took 400 people, Chinese people, out of poverty, so that made the numbers. But we are not sure what happened to poverty in Africa. We don't have measurements. We don't. And it's a big problem. In our index, we measure everything. We are unable to measure poverty because there is no measure for that. So I spoke a couple of years ago with Mr. Barroso. We had a long session there, trying to convince him that really it is a good investment for European Union development programs in Africa to involve the re-establishment of these statistical offices. It's not expensive, it's simple, but it's very important for us to measure the outcomes of aid. You have duty to your voters, to your constituencies. People ask where this money goes. You need to be able to measure the outcomes. What is the outcome of our intervention? Did this policy work or didn't work? That's a scientific way of really managing whatever we do. Is managing the countries and also for you to manage your aid. So I really will suggest that you push your I guess it's your commission or whoever execute here to allocate some of this aid fund to build the statistical offices in the countries. That is essential. That's the capacity building, I think, is really important. The one issue about inequality, which a colleague here raised it, I fully agree with him. In our reports last year and the year before, when we produced the index, we raised that issue that while African economies are really developing at very good rate, average between 5 and 6%, the benefit of development is really restricted to a few percentage people at the top of the pyramid. And we said that is not sustainable. This is not sustainable development because the tension and the pressure on the fabric of society will be huge. What happened in the mines in South Africa, in my view, was a result that 3 directors in the company earn as much as the total number of miners, 2,500 people. Of course, what do you expect? So this is issue of disparity, really, where there's no effective, we've been told about trickle through, we don't see that trickle through. So the issue of sustainable development and how it is linked really to equitable development is really important. And so I fully agree with our friend there. I stop here to allow for more people.
Thank you very much. Michelle?
Oui, bon, tout a été dit. Je reviens.
Well, I think most things have been said. I'll just briefly come back to the question of China, India and Brazil, who of course are the major emerging powers. And of course the European Union is already suffering from this because there is unfair competition going on. But we need to find a compromise with these powers. Otherwise, we're not going to be satisfied. So let's be clear on that. They don't have the same values, if we can put it that way. For example, in Africa, entire towns are being built by the Chinese, but they're not hiring Africans. They bring in they're bringing in Chinese prisoners who provide slave labor. So from a human rights perspective, there's a huge gap between the European Union and China. So I think we're going to need to work very closely with these powers, but at the same time, we need to encourage them to change their perspective of matters. When it comes to sharing of wealth, well, we don't have the same vision there either. It's quite dramatic. When it comes to Turkey, well, it's a candidate country. Discussions are ongoing. It's a whole other debate. We're going to have to discuss the question of human rights with them again. When it comes to what's happening in Turkey right now, I think it's not the subject we're here to discuss. I don't want to start a debate on that. When it comes to sustainable development, well, there I would fully agree with my Greek colleague who spoke earlier. And I tried to say this earlier on. We need to realize that there are a lot of African countries, I'm thinking here in the Sahel band, they simply do not have enough to meet their needs. Nothing is growing. They have nothing. At the same time, these are rich countries. They have a lot of wealth under the ground, for example, but at the same time, we can't accept the fact that children die in the Sahel. The European Union must now invest, but we need to invest in a sustainable way. We no longer have the right to seize land. This is being done by China. When I hear people saying that we are injecting billions to save the banks, whereas in certain countries they have absolutely nothing, I can't agree with that. I think, perhaps I'm forcing my words here, but we need to have a real reform in the way policies are being implemented. We are seeing climate change. A lot of people are getting confused. They're confusing weather with climate because it's cold at the moment. We hear about extra gas production, but how far, and fracking, and how far are we going to go in using up the resources of our planet before we start asking ourselves real questions? There are other questions that need to be asked in advance, which is wealth sharing and back to basic values. And it's not just talking about our values, but having these values being respected, which is not happening in Europe at the moment.
Thank you very much. Now, we have a number of speakers left, and we have to conclude in about a half an hour. So I'm going to ask the remaining speakers to limit their contributions to 2 minutes each, and that way we'll make sure that everybody has a chance to ask their question and that the questions will also be answered. The first questioner is Nia Griffith from the United Kingdom House of Commons. So that's 2 minutes.
Sorry, conference, I'll make my 3 points very quickly. It's many years now since the fair trade movement was established, recognising the advantage of giving producers a fair price for their goods and enabling countries to develop economically through trade, not aid. We know that the USA has retained some protectionist policies which have been detrimental to developing countries. Now that we're talking about an EU-USA trading agreement, could we use this as an opportunity to look again at our trading practices and put pressure on the US to phase out their protectionism and create a more level playing field for developing countries? Secondly, there is now considerable public anger across Europe about aggressive tax avoidance by giant multinational companies, as has been mentioned by Dr. Abraham. If these global corporations show contempt for the taxes they owe morally, if not legally, in stable, sophisticated countries, clearly they will find tax loopholes when operating in more fragile states or states recovering from conflict. As we make moves to clamp down on tax havens and close tax loopholes, could we also be offering that expertise to help developing countries to strengthen their taxation regimes and optimise the collection of tax they are owed? Thirdly, would you agree that we should use our power of procurement more effectively? As the EU, we spend millions in developing countries. We should use our power of procurement in developing countries to demand from the companies which supply us more transparency of their financial affairs, compliancy with good safety standards, and a clear commitment not to discriminate against any sector of society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Ms. Ina Marie Eriksson Søreide from Norway.
Thank you, Chairman. I would also like to talk about the impact that China has on Africa and also the way that we do development aid. Because there is no doubt that it has been increasingly difficult to attach conditions to our aid, our development aid, compared to what China is doing in Africa. So it is increasingly difficult to say that we attach conditions on human rights, on good governance and other issues that was more easy to do earlier on. And secondly, I would like your comments on the way that we do consistency in our aid policies, because we do a lot of discussions on how much aid we allocate, but the real issue is investments, trade, and also transfer of knowledge. To give you one example, one Norwegian oil company allocates or pays in taxes to Angola alone the same amount of money as we spend on development aid to many different countries in the world. So the whole Norwegian development aid budget is equal to what Statoil pays in taxes in Angola alone, which is quite much, I think. That equals 3.75 billion euros. And thirdly, I would just like your comments also on where you see the future of European development policies, because it's no doubt that it's about to change dramatically, and what is happening with China and also other actors in Africa is going to change how we do development policies. And how do you see that from your perspective? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Herman de Croo from Belgium.
Monsieur le Président, merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you very much. Now, I've been very much involved in cooperation for the past 50 years, and I have to say in Belgium we have an Eastern African Centre for Research and Excellence. Now, I would call into question the whole issue of corruption and tax, but also the whole supply chain for money laundering, where you buy at a higher price, be it rubber or diamonds or whatever, and use these operations to launder money. There's no corruption without people who engage in corruption. And I think this is all very worrying for the population. In Congo, for example, you have 2 million individual well, there's a major problems. And I think that we have to look at Europe as well. Europe's not immune. You can have, let's say, British oil companies that are prospecting in Virunga, for example, a protected area, a UN protected area. You also have military operations and revolutions that are pragmatic and engaging for commercial reasons to get at resources. And what I'm struck by is destruction of forests, not just for any need for timber, but every year a big part of deforestation is due to using wood as fuel. People need it for heating and to cook their food, and this has a huge negative impact. Europe is simply not paying enough attention. And I mentioned this morning the number of people that live on €1 a day. But we need to ask, how much money do we, Europe, pay, and how much of that ends up with those that we want to help? I would suggest about 15%.
Danielle O'Roy from France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Well, thank you, Chairman. I'd like to come back to this issue of financing as currently proposed. There's a cut in development aid, and it's unacceptable. It's unacceptable precisely when there's the challenge of climate change, and we're robbing Peter to give Paul. Now, climate change is an issue in itself. There are people who are suffering from that. Several examples, and climate change is going to lead to climate change refugees if we don't help the countries already suffering from this, and will be suffering even more in the future. And private interest can't be left to replace the European development funds. As you know, it's private. If you look in Bangladesh, for example, what working conditions are totally unacceptable for workers in these countries, and we need to set aside some of the revenue from the financial transaction tax to development. When it was referred to as the Tobin tax, that was the original idea. The FTT should be spent on development. Otherwise, we just look to our own interests, and it makes no sense to the countries in the south who want solidarity, and they want to be able to live from their own resources. We're pillaging those resources as far as we can, with shale gas or what have you, and it's quite unacceptable to cut development aid at this point.
The next speaker is Pascal Donoghue from Ireland.
Thank you, Chairman, and I want to thank all of the panel for their contribution this afternoon. I just have two questions, one for Dr. Ibrahim. I was struck by the point that you made there regarding trying to improve the quality of leader within Africa from a top-down point of view via initiatives like your own prize.